Guys, buckle up for a new episode of You and the Law Podcast, the one and only law enforcement podcast that's tackling critical policing and social justice issues and provides insights into the daily realities of policing with your host, Chief Virgil Green.
Hey, everyone, welcome to everybody to another episode of You and the Law Podcast show. I'm the host of the show, Chief Green, and hopefully we've got some technical difficulties worked out.
I can hear you fine, so I think it's
well. I think we're live and we're ready to rock and roll, man. I definitely apologize for the technical issues that never happened, but Eric, I guess that's what happens when you do a live podcast.
right.
All right. Well, hopefully, those who have tuned in will definitely join us back again. If you're watching us on YouTube, thank you for tuning in on YouTube. If you're tuned in on Facebook, definitely thank you for tuning in on Facebook and LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, thank you for tuning in on LinkedIn. If you have any comments throughout the podcast, put them in the chat and we'll definitely get to your comments. But I want to introduce my guest who's joining us on tonight's podcast. Eric, tell the listeners about you and where you're at and what you're doing and what your passion is about.
Well, sure. First of all, thanks very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. We were met on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. All the people that I've met and the friends I've made and colleagues I've connected with on there. So my name's Eric Threlkeld. I'm a captain with the Eddy County Sheriff's Office, which most people might not know. It's in the southeast corner of the state of New Mexico, kind of down close to Texas, West Texas. We're a pretty rural area, a little over 4,000 square miles in our county, and our sheriff's office has got about 80 sworn deputies, and we're pretty progressive as far as keeping on top of technology and forward thinking on modern approaches to law enforcement. I've been here about 14 years. I started my career in New Mexico. It's hard to say it out loud, but 1987. So I've been around for a while.
You're young, bro. You're young, man.
Started out in a smaller agency, and then I was there for a short time and went to the Albuquerque Police and stayed there for several years. Was a patrol officer, a detective in the child abuse unit, and eventually made my way up to Colorado in El Paso County with the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, a fairly large sheriff's office and pretty good sized metropolitan area. And it was there that I kind of got my real strong interest in domestic violence. I had an opportunity to go work in a specialized team there, the Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team, which was funded by VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. And up until that point, I, like everybody, like all of us in law enforcement, I worked with plenty of domestic violence cases, but I didn't have a lot of advanced training on it, a lot of thorough understanding of the dynamics of it all. And that position really helped me. I got to travel around the country, look at other people's programs, and we were a national demonstration site, so a lot of people came through to see our program.
Okay.
And it was kind of an eye-opening experience. I took that, and if you might remember, back in the very end of the 90s, 1999, early 2000s, there was a war in former Yugoslavia, and the province at that time, which was called Kosovo, was breaking away from Yugoslavia, and it wasn't a peaceful breakup.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to work one day, and there was a sign on the bulletin board that said, "Hey, the sheriff the State Department's recruiting for American police officers to go work with the United Nations police in Kosovo, and if you get accepted, we'll give you a 1-year leave of absence." And it seemed like a really amazing opportunity. I applied and ended up going there for about 3 years, and that kind of turned into a further international work with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and went to the neighboring country of North Macedonia. I got to travel, do some work in Armenia and several other Southeastern European some other Southeastern European countries. And a lot of it had a domestic violence focus. A lot of it had, for sure, all had a community-oriented policing focus, mostly working with police leaders and helping the police integrate back into post-war environments, or what were nearly war-like environments, and working with community leaders, mayors, and politicians, and local community groups to try to get the police back in peacefully, and explaining different processes and how we can facilitate that. Came back to the U.S. eventually, and I went to work for the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, again with a major focus on domestic violence, and another overseas work, and eventually came back to Eddy County, which came here because that's where my parents were at the time, and went to work for the Eddy County Sheriff's Office, worked my way up from patrol to now captain. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. I got an opportunity to go to the FBI National Academy a few years back. Got my master's degree from University of Virginia.
Well, you definitely have had a you said 1987, but man, you definitely had what I'm gonna say a stellar career all the way up until now in law enforcement, especially being able to have the opportunity to go into another country and see how they policed. And so before I ask you this next question, and you mentioned where you're at right now in Carlsbad, a lot of people have probably been to the Carlsbad Cavern. That's kind of what Carlsbad is kind of known for, is the Carlsbad Cavern. And, our former president, Barack Obama, I think when he was in office, brought his family to Carlsbad, which I kind of thought was interesting, that out of all places in the United States, Carlsbad was chosen to take a vacation to.
Right. Yeah, if you haven't been, it's worth the trip. It really is. It's a beautiful national park. And
it is. And as I shared with you, New Mexico is my home state. I'm a native of New Mexico, born and raised in Hobbs, and spent a lot of time in Carlsbad Caverns. And, that's probably 30 years ago. And I'm pretty sure it definitely has changed a lot in the past 30 years. So,
right.
Yeah, but yeah, Eric, so just to go back to your experience in going into another country, and back, I think you said that was in early 2000, or what was your experience going into another country, how they were policing and how we were policing here in the United States?
So what happened at the end of the conflict in Kosovo was there really was no police department, police agency for the country. It sort of dissolved. Most of the officers who remained left. When most of them were ethnic Serbians, they left. So there really was no functioning police department, and that was the part of the role. The United Nations, along with the OSCE, got together, and our main goal was to train local people to be police officers and take over to get rid of us. And it was so the laws and the experience that people had to fall back on, that the police had to fall back on, were what was left over from Yugoslavia. And domestic violence, for example, was not a major focus at all. And the justice system is very different from the United States, the court systems that were in place. And there was a lot of growing pains, a lot of effort was put into different projects that weren't very successful, but over time, I think they made a lot of headway. I go back fairly regularly. I was there this past spring or summer, and it's amazing to see the advancements that have occurred there. And domestic violence is one of those areas that they've made great strides in. Still a long way to go, but it's much different than it was in the 2000s. So one of the main differences that I noticed is this hierarchical pyramid structure that is to an extreme compared to what we have in the United States. There's a lot of reluctance to allow line officers to make decisions for themselves. Pretty much nobody did anything without an assignment, a specific assignment, and those tend to have very tight parameters on what you were allowed to do at any certain time or any certain day. Politics was a great influencer on whether enforcement action was going to be taken, what political party were you affiliated with, and that still goes on today in many of the countries in that area. And so that it's a dynamic that I just wasn't prepared for. So you're trying to have a conversation with officers about how to be community oriented, and the system was kind of not set up to deal with that mindset, because that wasn't the major focus. So we struggled through that. A lot of things have gotten better over time. It was a wonderful experience. It's the best thing I ever did in my career, was to see through the lens of others how they do law enforcement, because not just dealing with the local communities I was in, but there were officers from many other countries. So I got all kinds of viewpoints and learned different styles and techniques, and from across the board, you name it. I worked with officers from Poland and Russia and Turkey and other Western European countries, Germany and Canada. And so that was just amazing to get their perspective on what we were dealing with there and how things work in their countries.
Yeah. So did, going into this, Eric, was there any kind of language barriers there as you're talking to people about, hey, especially domestic violence?
Sure.
And yeah.
Sure. I mean, Americans we're pretty spoiled when it comes to language. We don't work very hard to learn second languages, and I will no exception.
Yeah.
Because pretty much anywhere in the world, you're going to find somebody that speaks English.
Yeah.
But for people in other places, it can be a matter of life or death whether they learn a second language or not. And I saw that firsthand. So unfortunately, I had to do most of my job through a language assistant who went with me pretty much everywhere. I did learn some of the local language, not nearly enough to be fluent in it.
To be fluent in it. Yeah.
And then you're always worried I got something out of context and you're not really understanding what I'm trying to say. So you pretty much did everything through a language assistant. Yeah. And that definitely slows down the process when you're doing training or just having a conversation on the street. It really does slow things down. I would say that Kosovars are some of the most patient people. They took time. They waited for you to get your point across and carefully. And they're very welcoming, amazing culture, and super appreciative of the United States' efforts there.
Yeah. Eric, I want to kind of go back. I reached out to you on LinkedIn, and as you mentioned, you've met so many people on LinkedIn that have reached out to you. You've made so many friends, and just with seeing your post on LinkedIn, which is quite frequent, almost every day, if not every day, every other day. And it drew me to wanting to have this conversation with you about, trauma-informed policing, domestic violence, because it is something that we deal with all the time. And, as you're talking about going into other countries and training officers, what was that experience like, and how was it received? Because is domestic violence as prevalent there in those countries as it is here in the United States? And do people kind of like cover it up and kind of ignore it, or what was your experience there?
So the dynamics of domestic violence, in my experience, are pretty similar no matter where you go.
Okay.
The causes and the reasons behind it are pretty much the same, which is at the core of it is power and control. One person trying to maintain power and control over another in an intimate partner relationship.
Yeah.
And that's the same. There are some cultural issues that may differ from place, region to region, place to place, but the underlying reality of it is it's very similar. I don't know what the current statistics are in the places I was working, but they weren't far removed from what we have here in the United States. And the things that we would look for high risk of lethality behavior are the same across the board. And when it comes to being trauma informed, really, when I was there, in the early 2000s, that wasn't even a term that I recall in training in law enforcement. It was, you might have, there are some people that are kind of naturally good at it. Some officers that are really naturally good at it, and others are not very good at it. And I think I want to say that I've always been sort of good at it, but I didn't really understand the term and why it was so important. It's not rocket science. There are some extensive trainings that you can go to. I think it can be really problematic for agencies to get everybody a lengthy training on how to use trauma-informed interviewing, but there are some short, quick, and down and dirty techniques that we could all learn a lot about. Something simple is, instead of asking somebody what's wrong with you, saying what's happened to you.
Yeah,
would be one example. And keeping empathy at the forefront of your conversations. We sometimes in law enforcement, we tend to get a little bit robotic.
Yeah.
Just the facts man, kind of the Joe Friday, if anybody remembers who he was, approach to talking, and it's not helpful. But understanding the effects, studying and reading about the effects of trauma and how it affects people's response to being interviewed. Understanding that victims are not going to necessarily give you information in a chronological order. Like we want everything to be in our police reports. But letting people talk without interrupting them is so important. Someone who's experienced a trauma. One of the examples I give is, in most of our agencies these days, if an officer's involved in a shooting, we don't jump into a detailed conversation with them about what happened, because we know it's a traumatic event, and things aren't going to maybe come out the same initially as they will after you've had some time to recuperate a little bit and think about it. And we often don't give victims of crime that same grace. Sometimes because we just can't. Like, I got to know something right now. It's a public safety issue. But when it comes down to asking detailed questions, just understanding that this you're not going to have a perfect victim. This is going to take some time and empathy and understanding, and avoiding re-traumatizing somebody with your questioning techniques.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I had on a guest about a month ago. She's actually from my hometown of Hobbs. Her name is Beverly Hutchison, and she wrote a book about talking about toxic relationships, and and I think that is something that and it's from a spiritual lens, and I think it's something that this is a topic that's not really often talked about as much as it should be, and because it depending on your culture, what race you are, is really kind of frowned upon to even report that you're a victim of a domestic violence. And the one thing that we've talked about on a podcast, Eric, is that, and I want to know from your experience and get your opinion about this. You've got officers who are dealing with the same thing that they're out in the field trying to help other citizens deal with. You've got officers who are experiencing domestic violence at home, being in a toxic relationships. And, as we're talking about this topic tonight, what is trauma-informed policing and training? Just a week ago, I don't know if you saw this, but I want to say I think she was a deputy in either Georgia or in Texas. She was killed. She was shot and killed by her husband, and her son was actually seriously injured, and she was a deputy with the sheriff department. And I even just know, even in Oklahoma, over the last couple of years, there's been some incidents that have happened with um, individuals who have worked either with the local police department or the sheriff department. I specifically know in Cleveland County where uh, a wife was hurt. They both worked for law enforcement agencies, and she was ended up killed by her husband. So what's when you have officers who are experiencing this and it's not really talked about, but now they're out in the community responding to calls, dealing with people who are victims of domestic violence, they may not have that same empathy. So uh, how do you tackle something like that, uh, because they're not really helping the victim?
Right. Yeah, that's tough because there are many of us who have been victims of domestic violence or grew up in a violent home, and maybe a little numb to the whole experience when you're dealing with someone else
Mm-hmm.
who's going through it. But I've also seen it go the other way, where you do have more empathy and understanding of the situation. And I think training is super important, and making sure that officers understand that, because even if they've been a victim of domestic violence or grew up with it in their home, they may not really understand the dynamics.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely a training issue. So getting that out there, which I've seen, in my experience, I've seen some minds opened a lot to because they didn't really understand all the dynamics. I use myself as an example. I didn't grow up in a violent home. My first experience was on the job, and I remember thinking things like, "What the heck? Why would you stay here? Why would you put up with this?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you pack your stuff and get out?" I didn't know the whole issue with the economic situation,
Mm-hmm.
issues of immigration issues, for example, and worrying that someone's going to get deported because they're not staying in the home with this
Yeah.
the abuser. Um, the coercive control behaviors that are not necessarily a crime, but they become overwhelming for so many victims, where they cannot get the wherewithal to get out and become survivors. Um, there's I don't know if you're familiar with the the ACE test, the adverse childhood experiences. It's a wonderful tool, and I would recommend all of us in law enforcement take that test. It's not
Mm-hmm.
difficult; it just takes a few minutes. It will really open your eyes to understanding how the things that have occurred to you in your life have a propensity to affect you later on. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean if you score high, you're going to be a domestic violence abuser. It just means these are things you need to be aware of and understand that you're going to have some biases
Yeah.
that we all have, and being aware of those, so you can really effectively work on the basic principles of trauma-informed policing, which for all of us, officers and victims alike, is safety, right?
Yeah.
That would be the primary point here, ensuring our physical and emotional safety for survivors and victims and ourselves. Learning to treat people with empathy and dignity. Not looking at people just as cases, that they're not just numbers, they're people. And so being open-ended in our questioning, being non-judgmental. I like to use the term start with believing.
Mm-hmm.
Until someone shows you otherwise, that they're not being truthful, that they're taking you down the wrong path, start out with an open mind that, hey, I'm going into this thinking they're going to tell me the truth.
Yeah.
We're all, not all, but most of us are pretty good judges of whether someone's being truthful with us or not.
Yeah.
But so, statements like, "What's wrong with you? What is instead of what's happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
Are you okay? Are you safe?" That building some rapport is so important, because if you don't have that, many times the victims of trauma, you're not going to get any disclosure. They're just not going to feel safe enough to tell you what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Being transparent, letting them know we all have procedures we've got to follow, letting them know ahead of time this is how it's going to work, and why you may be having to ask some uncomfortable questions, and try to give trauma victims as much choice and empower them as much as possible to make their own decisions and choices about how they're going to participate in the process. It'll help them. It'll help you moving these cases forward, and make the practical application so much more powerful.
Yeah. Well, Eric, and as we talk about what is trauma-informed policing, and I want to, thank those who are just now tuning into the podcast. For our topic tonight is definitely an important topic to talk about. What is trauma-informed policing in training? Because it's all about training police officers to understand what they're dealing with. I've said this a lot, Eric. We spend a lot of time out on the range learning how to shoot, but we don't spend a lot of time training in other issues related that we're dealing with in society. And this is one of those type of trainings that often does not get the same amount of time and focus on. And Eric, one of the things, this is a pretty much male dominant field that we're in. Have you had, throughout your travel around the country teaching this type of training? First of all, you have to have that trust with the person that you're dealing with, who's that victim.
Right.
What's been your experience, or can you speak on how going into agencies, is this something that you kind of see where officers have been kind of hesitant, but once they get into the training, they kind of change their mindset as to, hey, maybe I've done some things wrong on some other domestic violence calls, but this is really going to help me?
I've seen both. I would say it leans more heavily toward people who have, I don't want to call it an epiphany, but a change in heart before the end of the training, saying, yeah, okay, I see some things. One of the questions I ask people at the beginning of training often is how many of you have made a dual arrest? How many of you have arrested both parties in a domestic violence call? And often I see a lot of hands raised.
Yeah.
And then we start talking about that subject, and like, do you think that was effective? Do you think it really helped the situation?
Yeah.
And if you delve into the case even just a little bit, you'll find 90 times out of 100, no, it wasn't very effective.
Yeah.
It was just a way for me to deal with what was going on at that moment. I felt like I couldn't determine who a predominant aggressor was. It was, things were out of control, and I had to protect people, so I arrested both of them. And we have the Fifth Amendment in the United States, and I'll say, look, we all know what that is, right? You don't have to testify against yourself.
Yeah.
If you don't have some independent witness of these two people fighting that's going to come to court and say, yes, this was definitely a mutual combat situation. They both decided they were just going to duke it out in the living room. I said, that case is not going anywhere. And very likely that's not what happened. There's always going to be a predominant aggressor. And so, and it does take time. It's frustrating. We've got to do our due diligence trying to figure it out, because arresting both parties is just, it's pretty much a waste of time.
Eric, I am so glad that you brought that up, because throughout your career, my career, you that's almost kind of like the easy, I hate to say it, but the easy way out of dealing with a problem, because you may have said, hey, this is my fourth time being to this house in during my shift, or maybe the fourth time in a week, or whatever it may be. And you kind of gotten tired of dealing with the same individual. So you're basically going to say, I'm just taking you both to jail. Now you got to deal with, are there kids in the home? How is that going to impact the kids in the home? How is that going to impact those individuals who may end up losing their job because of circumstances that they kind of put themselves in? But oftentimes I've heard people say, well, that's their fault. That's not my problem. And I kind of go back to a word that you used earlier. Where's the empathy there? Because somebody is dealing with some type of trauma, and oftentimes they're trying to find somebody who's going to help them. And I I haven't really seen a lot of help that we can offer to people, so you don't have to, unless there are just some serious injuries to one of them. How do you work this out to where you don't take both of them to jail, that don't impact their livelihood, that doesn't impact the family? Um, so how, that is, and I think some people say, well, the law makes it pretty difficult for me not to do this.
Yeah. So in New Mexico, as you probably know, you were in law enforcement here. We have an expectation from the legislature that we're going to do our due diligence and figure out who the predominant aggressor is.
Mm-hmm.
And because they understood that this is ineffective. So we there's things we've got to look at besides what's right in front of us. To give you an example, that happened. It happened here recently, where you go to a call and you have a victim who has a black eye,
Mm-hmm.
and you're like, okay, tell me about that. What happened with that black eye? Well, let's say it's the male. Well, she punched me. I got a black eye. She punched me. Yeah, we were having an argument about finances, and she punched me. And if we stop there and go arrest her for punching him in the eye, that's
Mm-hmm.
all we have.
Mm-hmm.
We have not done a thorough investigation, because more often than not, if we really take our time, and these cases do take time,
Yeah.
that we go uncover the history of the violence in this relationship. Yes, I want to know how you got that black eye, but I want to know what's happened. What other violent incidences, if any, have occurred with you? And let's talk about those. Let's talk about, um, was this a self-defense situation?
Mm-hmm.
We've got to look at that, and we want to know. We want to be asking victims, how does this make you feel? Because, and some officers say, oh, that's touchy feely stuff. I don't really care how they feel. I want to know the facts.
Yeah.
Well, part of the facts is understanding how somebody feels.
Yeah.
I use the analogy of a burglary victim. They pretty much tell you how they feel when you're there. Yeah, someone broke in and stole my stuff. I'm angry. I'm upset. I want you to go find them, arrest them, throw them in prison. That's not always going to be true on domestic violence cases. It may
Correct.
be silence. And maybe,
Yeah.
no, I am too fearful to tell you what's really happened here. So we've got to go back, build a history, look at previous calls for service that we have records of those.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to get the understand how people are feeling and what do they think is going to happen when we leave here today.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be parked in front of your house waiting for it to happen again.
Exactly.
So understanding that, looking for those clues, that making sure that we're interviewing witnesses. You talked about children being affected by these cases. That's a really important area where we've got to recognize the trauma for kids. And what I teach in our agency is we don't want to be having in-depth interviews with kids on the scene at a domestic violence call. That needs to be a forensic interview, a specialized team, or a safe house of somewhere where you can take these children to have a non-confrontational, low stress environment, or because you're going to put a child into a box that is going to be a lose-lose situation for everybody.
Exactly.
And they change their story later on because they were trying to protect mom or protect dad, or they're saying what they think the officer wants them to say, because they don't have a clear understanding of how to do a trauma-informed interview with a child. It's going to be a disaster. And the same with our victims and our survivors, avoiding those rapid fire questions like we tend to get as police officers. We want to slow things down, give time for emotional breaks, and using reassuring body language. Not towering over someone. Try to bring things down a few notches using a calm tone, an open posture, having a non-threatening presence. And that's difficult for some officers. Some of us come across as very intimidating, very threatening. And understanding those limitations you may have and trying to put them to minimize it as best as we can, and know what our resources are in our community, because this is not purely a law enforcement problem. This is a community issue, and if we're not addressing it from a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach, we will not be effective. So knowing, like, okay, I know I have a battered family shelter in my town. Well, have you ever been there? Have you ever met the people who run that place?
Yeah.
Would they know you if you called them up and said, "Hey, I've got a victim here. I need some help with?" Do you know your victim advocates, your nonprofit victim advocates? It's so important. A lot of us, we deal with advocates who are attached to a prosecutor's office, which can be super helpful.
Yeah.
But in most jurisdictions, that's not going to kick in until you file the criminal charges against someone.
Exactly.
They're not going to be there to answer the call at 3 a.m. and get on. So knowing resources like the National Domestic Violence Hotline is so important. And a shout out to them. I'm on their regional advisory board. It's an amazing organization. So, and they know most all of the local resources as well. So if you're calling them and saying, I'm in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and I don't know the local resources, I call the national hotline. They'll connect me with the right people.
Yeah.
So officers need to have those numbers available and that information available.
Yeah. Well, and Eric, and I think that's as you talk about the collaboration with other community partners, that is something that is real vital in the efforts to try to bring other people in to try to what resources they may have, because as we don't have all the answers and all the resources, and the fact if you can have whether it's a nonprofit organization or if you have some relationship with your faith-based community, and I think one thing, Eric, and to get your opinion on this, I just don't think we do a good enough job of really connecting with everybody in our communities, from the faith-based community to the nonprofit organizations, and saying, hey, if we have this type of a situation, it may be a large family. You may respond to a call where there may be 6 kids in the home, and what do you do then? And when you see that there are some things going on in the home, and you got to try to really start connecting or having people respond that has some other services available. How is that in? And I'm gonna kind of go back. You're in Carlsbad, and I'm from Hobbs, and there's a large Hispanic population in both of those cities,
Right.
because Carlsbad is actually more closer to El Paso, and you do have a lot of families who don't speak English. It's not their first language. They're afraid of law enforcement because they don't want to be deported. That's that fear. How do you overcome some of those challenges in the community, and also speak upon how does that impact the officers' training when it comes to trauma-informed training?
Well, let's start with the language barrier thing, because it's a big one. I mean, as you said, we're half of our population in my area is Hispanic, of Hispanic origin. Many of them, as you said, are not native English speakers. Some of them don't speak English at all. Yeah. And we have a few officers that do, but not nearly enough.
Exactly.
And we from time to time will see officers kind of give you an example. What happened in my agency just recently, where an officer was using Google Translate to translate Spanish into English.
Yeah,
because we didn't have someone that could come to the scene. It was a really just didn't. We reached out to a neighboring agency. They didn't happen to have anybody on duty. There was just no one, and it was kind of a last ditch effort.
Yeah,
and it was not
effective.
It wasn't helping. It was getting the whole thing backwards.
Yeah,
and so most of us have a dispatch authority of some kind. A dispatch. They have resources. They have translation services that they can call, and my recommendation would use that, because then you're going to get a real human who's going to understand how to translate from many different languages effectively back into English. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's painstakingly slow sometimes, but you got to be patient, because otherwise you could really mess things up, could arrest the wrong party. You may miss some really important information that could be life-saving. So don't use neighbors, don't use children, for goodness sake, to translate for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I want to say this real quick. You just mentioned don't use children to translate, because oftentimes kids can speak better English than their parents can.
Sure.
And I've had to tell situations of officers, don't use the kids to translate for you.
Right.
And there's been some resistance as to, well, why can't I? And I'm like, well, they are a victim themselves.
Right.
And, you have to find another way to remove them from that. And again, that just goes back to the training. When you talk about trauma-informed training, that is the first thing. Hey, he or she can speak better English, so let them translate. That's a bad position to put kids in.
Yeah, it really is. So, for many agencies, it's a real culture change on taking things from a trauma-informed perspective.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of work. It's learning to balance this thing that gets drilled into our head in the academy about we've got to be in control to keep the scene safe, which is true, but we've also got to be able to have a empathy and understanding, and to be able to balance that out. So understanding the basics of trauma science, some things that help really well a lot, I think, is role play training. These are things you can do in shift briefings. Just getting some videos that that are very short and to the point on some examples of how to be more empathetic, how to use trauma-informed language when you're asking questions. We're moving from this command and compliance form of policing to a mindset of trust, and a more of a partnership approach. It's not an easy process for many of us, but we're making headway.
Yeah. So, Eric, and I may have asked this question already, but as you travel around the country, do you see where this training is something that, we should have been doing probably 5 years, 10 years ago? Some agencies probably do a good job in making sure that officers have this type of training. Or do you see where some agencies, they do utilize, there may be, like an expanded response unit, or a different unit or group of people who can respond to these type of calls, and kind of remove the officers from that, but you bring in a specialized group of people who can talk through some of those things. It may have a little bit different perspective on the situation that they're dealing with.
So I've seen some of both. I haven't seen that so much with domestic violence calls. They tend to be handled, at least initially, at
the patrol
level.
Yeah.
And I think practically for most agencies, it's just not feasible to bring a team to every call.
Yeah.
I know there's some places where they do that as much as possible, but most of us just don't have those resources. I see it more in mental health crisis situations.
Yeah.
Like in my jurisdiction, where we have a team that can come out, and many of these are not really law enforcement issues. They're someone who's suicidal, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else is in danger. It's just that individual. Having a team come out that may not even include law enforcement can be really powerful. So it kind of runs the gambit in my experience. I tell, I train a lot on domestic violence in my state, and giving officers a special certification to instruct this topic for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a lot about that these specialized units are few and far between, But that doesn't mean that you can't have a subject matter expert in every agency, no matter how small it is. And we know most what the average size of a police department in the United States is about 5 officers.
Yeah.
It's very small. And having a domestic violence team is just not, it's not going to happen.
Exactly.
But you can have at least one person there who's, hey, this is the person who knows the ins and outs of the system. They have all of the contact information. They do training with their colleagues, and then that person can reach out and kind of form maybe an ad hoc team, but you're going to find that prosecutor who really takes these cases on and puts a tremendous amount of effort in them, who really is going to go to bat for victims, and they're going to listen to officers and they're going to move these cases through the system. You know who your child, your CYFD, children, youth, and families people are, the best person to contact with those agencies. You know who your nonprofit advocates are. You know your advocates with the prosecutor's office. You know all of the things that may be available in other jurisdictions that are not far from yours. But having all of that person is so important to bring the community together to handle these.
Eric, I want to just remind those who are just now tuning into the podcast that tonight's topic is what is trauma-informed policing? And we've got Eric on talking about his training that he does in New Mexico and around the country related to trauma-informed policing and dealing with responding to calls for domestic violence. And, Eric, and as we talked about, the language barriers in that part of New Mexico, and, you've got Eddy County, you've got Lee County, which is kind of border each other. But as you just mentioned, you have a lot of small rural agencies in those counties that may not have the opportunities to this type of training, but they're still dealing with those type of calls related to domestic violence.
Sure.
And the one thing that I've said, and you mentioned that in the United States, almost 70% of agencies are, 10-man agencies and below. And so what has been your experience outside of the area that you're in when it comes to trying to provide that type of training? Have you seen some resistance to that? Have you seen some openness to saying, hey, yeah, we deal with these type of issues in our communities, but man, we just don't have the money to send these officers to training?
So one thing that we do is we send out invitations to those smaller agencies. Come join us. We're going to be doing the training on this topic. Come be part of our group. That can help. And in understanding though that you're probably not going to be able to train everybody. If it's an agency with 4 or 5, 8 officers, maybe you only get one. Maybe you get 2 because they have shifts to cover, right? And they have staffing issues as well.
Yeah.
So it takes time, and then there tends to be a high turnover in law enforcement in general, and that happens in small and large agencies.
Yeah.
So it's a never-ending process of training and retraining. But I've seen, in my experience, most of us are pretty on board with learning new things and wanting to get the best information to do our jobs effectively. I think that we're made up of an awful lot of really good people who want to do the right thing, and we got into this business to help others. I mean, it maybe sound a little bit corny, but it's true.
Yeah, it is.
Over time, some of us maybe get a little off track with that. We get a little jaded. We get a little burned out.
Yeah.
And need to step back and reassess remembering why we got in this in the first place. And, driving fast and arresting bad guys, that's cool, but that's not the core reason for most of us why we got into this.
Yeah, definitely in policing. I think a lot, especially a younger generation, is like, hey, we want to respond to the shootings and all these other things, or we want to get into the pursuits. But when you really get down to it, there's a lot of other really impactful things that you can do in your career to really help the community and really do this here for the reason of just being a public servant. And so, I think with a new generation of those who are coming into policing, let's kind of talk about that for a moment. Do you see any difference in your generation or our generation and a new generation of people coming into policing? And it's not something that people are just running into like they were in the late 80s and 90s.
Yeah, there's definitely a change, and I, contrary to what some may say, I don't think it's necessarily a bad one. I think you hear a lot that officers, newer officers particularly, they don't want to hear you're going to do it because I said so. That's just not going to be very effective.
Yeah.
They are going to ask why, and we need to be able to give them the why. I don't think it's unreasonable. So when you're trying to implement change, like maybe more trauma informed approaches, understanding that we need to explain why. I think the issues of, I mean, when you and I started out, it was kind of unusual to see officers move around from one agency to another.
Yeah.
Many of us just stayed there until we retired, and that was it. That was expected, and it's not the case anymore. There's not as much loyalty as I see to a particular agency, but there is a lot of loyalty to the job, a lot of loyalty to the real reason that they got into it to begin with. So if they're not getting answers to their why questions, they may not stay around.
Yeah.
And so I mean, that's just a few things that I've seen, but despite the dramatic changes in the landscape of law enforcement that I've seen over my career, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to be okay. That these issues with staffing issues and maybe not nearly as much interest in the career, it's going to get better. I really think it will.
Yeah. Well, you just touched on something that every agency is dealing with around the country. Some deal with it, some or don't, but I don't think anybody is exempt from it, Eric, is that like you just mentioned, you have people who are getting into this profession, they're trying to find the right fit for them. And like you said, there's not that much loyalty as it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago, where people just stay there and they just ride it out. But you got people who are saying, hey, if I'm here for 2 years or 3 years, if it's not working, then I'm gonna go somewhere else, because the positions are out there, and they're just trying to find the right fit for them, for their career to get to that 20-year retirement. And some people kind of frown upon that, Eric, especially when you get into a position like me, being a police chief, that it's kind of like, where's the loyalty at? You're kind of jumping from agency to agency. But I just think, again, it's a different generation of people who don't look at policing the way guys did, 20, 30 years ago. And so, and domestic violence is something that we have to deal with. Often officers, they would rather probably be out giving somebody a traffic ticket versus dealing with a domestic violence. And we also know that domestic violence can be one of the most deadliest calls that officers respond to. And you've seen this where one of the parties may turn on the officer, because if you're arresting the husband or you're arresting the wife, things kind of turn. And so officers really need to know how to deal with that.
Yes, and we were talking about. Well, I was saying about officers asking why and being able to answer that, and this is a great example of them not having a good understanding of why we need to be trauma informed, why we need to have lethality assessment tools, because it makes you safer.
Yeah.
For example, if we're not asking about strangulation, we're missing an important, and there was strangulation.
Yeah.
That's an important clue for officer safety, because we know if someone is a strangler, that you as an officer are at a much higher risk of being killed by that person. stranglers.
Yeah.
Stranglers are killers, not just of domestic violence victims, but of police officers. We know that around 60% of mass shootings that have occurred in the United States have a domestic violence nexus. The shooters were victims of domestic violence, perpetrators of domestic violence, all the way back to the earliest recorded mass shooting in the United States in the 60s, and when the shooter got up on the tower at the University of Austin, or in Austin, at University of Texas, and he killed his mother and his wife before he went and started shooting students from the tower. And so the Pulse nightclub shooter documented instances of strangulation against his wife. So, but if we're not asking, we're not keeping ourselves safe. We're not keeping our communities safe. And so when you get resistance from officers saying, well, this whole trauma-informed thing is soft policing, it's like, no, it's all about officer safety. It's about victim safety, community safety. And these cases take time. I'll give an example. I like to compare it to how much time do we spend investigating a non-injury traffic crash? Non-injury. Two cars run into each other in an intersection, and they've got people in both vehicles. We've got to take measurements. We've got to draw a diagram. We've got to interview the people in the car. Which seat were you sitting in? Did you have a seatbelt on or not? If there's kids in there, we got to identify them. And we spend all this time investigating these kinds of cases. And who are we doing it for? For an insurance company? Come on. Yes. So one of the major downfalls I see in these kinds of investigations, sexual assault cases and domestic violence cases, is first-line supervisors have got to be on board with allowing their people the time to do thorough investigations. And they've got to slow things down. They've got to be empathetic, and don't get in over your head interviewing somebody on something you don't have a lot of expertise on. For example, sexual assault. If that's a case is going to be worked by your detective division, why are we spending a lot of time asking questions about what occurred here? If a victim says, yes, I was sexually assaulted, I'm the victim, here's the offender, this is where it occurred, we get all that basic information, time, date, location, name, date of birth, and give it to a detective who can sit down with a victim advocate to be part of that interview, if at all possible. And we don't need all that detail. We don't need all that detail with children, because most of us are not trained in how to be trauma-informed with kids. So let's get those kids, get the basic facts, make sure everybody's safe. If they're volunteering information, are you hurt? Are you injured? All right. And if they volunteer information, of course we want to record it and we want to put it in our reports. But so first-line supervisors showing up on these calls, not to micromanage, but to be a mentor, to be a sounding board, to maybe some gentle reminders of, did you do A, B, C, and D? Having specialized domestic violence report forms are so important. To remind us all, because it's a lot. It's a lot of information to remember. You have stalking, you have strangulation, you have coercive control, you have building the history, and that's a lot to remember. But if you have a form that's reminding you, check this box, yes or no, a little diagram of the body, where the victim can point out where their injuries were, maybe a place for a victim to make a written statement if she wants to. Those are so impactful. And thank goodness gone are the days when we tried to fit everything into the size of a 3x5 card. We've all got computers, and we can put as much info as we need to, which should be a lot on these kinds of cases.
Well, and with technology, I mean, you can walk around with a tablet. It doesn't have to be big to try to keep all that information at your fingertips to kind of help you not forget what you need to be talking about. Eric, we're coming up on the last few minutes of the podcast, and this has been a great topic to talk about, and it's something that we can have another podcast about, to really dive in deeper into trauma-informed policing and training. I've seen women on TikTok talk about their experiences being a victim of domestic violence, and often I've kind of heard the same thing from the women that I've seen on TikTok talking about their experience. And I think we're just getting into an era where social media is being used, and people are feeling more comfortable to share what their experiences have been in a domestic violence situation, but most importantly, Eric, is how police responded to that. Uh, and I've heard women say they let my husband take my car, and I didn't have a car to go to work. They told me I had to leave, uh, and so, and I just think and you mentioned this earlier, you really have to look at this from a different high level and try to determine what all has happened, not just then, but before, and make some decisions that don't impact the victim uh, more than what it should.
Right. 100%.
Yeah. And so, um, and again, I think people, women are, we have men who are victims of domestic violence, but the majority of it, if you would agree, is women or victims of domestic violence.
Of course. Yeah, it's in over 90%. And I always have to make that disclaimer when I'm teaching is, hey, yeah, I'm going to be referring to victims as women.
Yeah.
Almost all the time, because that's the reality. They almost always are. But there are male victims, and we can't lose sight of that. And in my experience, the dynamics are very similar for men than they are for women.
Yeah.
And it may take you aback sometimes when you're listening to a male victim going, really?
Yeah.
And we do also know that it's very underreported across the board, but probably more so with men than it is with women. So we've got to be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I mentioned, Eric, and I don't know if it's ever happened in your agency or agencies around where an officer may respond to another officer's house related to a domestic violence situation, and where the officer is uh, the victim of that, and you got to work through those things to. Um, but it is something that we definitely need to talk about more. But one last question, everything kind of starts at the top, whether it's the sheriff or the police chief. Have you seen some resistance, or there's more buy-in from leaders, such in people in positions that I have, to say, yes, I want to invest in this type of training?
And another example of, yes, I've seen both. I've seen agency heads who are very informed about this topic, and
Mm-hmm.
they want to do the right thing, and they're willing to invest in their people and get the training and implement policy that is enforced.
Yeah.
And then I've seen the opposite, where no, it's just not a priority, and not understanding the dynamics, don't have a lot of buy-in, and it's very disheartening when you see that.
Yeah.
Because it's difficult. I mean, I give an example of the divert team that we have in my agency. It's something I'd wanted to do for years, but I just wasn't in a position to make it happen. When I finally got promoted to captain, I was like, okay, I'm going to do it now.
Yeah.
And but I still couldn't do it without the support of the sheriff and the chief deputy. And thank goodness I have that here, 100%.
Yeah.
But that's not the case everywhere. Sometimes it comes down to individual officers to learn for themselves to do the right thing, unfortunately. But you're not alone. There are other people in your community that will back you up on this. And you just got to be relentless on getting that message forward.
Exactly.
I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to be the change maker for my organization if it needs it. There are model policies out there. You mentioned officer-involved domestic violence. You got to have a policy on that. How are you going to handle it?
Yeah.
The IACP is a great resource. So, making sure that understanding that those dynamics and how they are exacerbated by someone who is in a powerful role as a law enforcement officer, and how they can manipulate the system and make things so much more difficult for victims, and maybe get empathy from you when they don't really deserve it.
Yeah.
So it's we just got to be educate ourselves on that, and making sure that we've got policies to cover it.
Yeah. 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 Well, hey, Eric, I want to say this before we get off. And as we just talked about, earlier, people that you've met on LinkedIn, and I want to definitely commend you for the dedication that you have to putting into this and doing this training around, not just in New Mexico, but outside of New Mexico. And I don't know if you know David Boggs.
I do very well, actually.
Yeah.
David is a mentor of mine for sure.
Oh, is he?
Many times, yes.
Is he? Well, David was a police chief in, I want to say, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I think he came from Kentucky, and that's how we connected when he came to Oklahoma. And we've been friends ever since. And LinkedIn definitely it definitely is the link in bringing people together. And David definitely spoke very highly of you and the training that you do when it comes to trauma-informed training. So, and I'm pretty sure David would probably hear this, and but so yeah, we both definitely have some mutual friends in common. So, but again, Eric, thank you for everything that you're doing to raise this awareness and to bring this type of training, not just in New Mexico, but outside of New Mexico.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you for this opportunity and for your podcast, because I know it's a lot of effort to do this, and it's needed, and you're doing wonders for the profession.
Well, so, I definitely appreciate it, and man, I don't want to wear that welcome out, but I'm definitely going to reach out to you again and invite you to come back on again, because you have a wealth of knowledge and experience to talk about this. And as I mentioned, I had on Beverly Hutchins, who wrote that book about, being in a toxic relationship. And I just think as we talk about trauma-informed police training and toxic relationship, they kind of come together. And so we might be able to have both of you all on to talk about what you're doing and what her book is trying to share with people who are victims of domestic violence.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
All right. I appreciate it, Eric. And again, thank you for tuning in to tonight's episode of You and the Law podcast, where we talked about trauma-informed policing. And, you can definitely catch this episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on our YouTube. And if you're not a subscriber to You and the Law podcast on YouTube, definitely go and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. It's free. And tell a friend about You and the Law podcast, and join us live every Thursday right here at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, as we stream live on Facebook Live and YouTube. And again, Eric, thank you. And everybody, make sure you tune in next Thursday for another episode of You and the Law podcast. Have a good night.
That's a wrap on this episode of You and the Law podcast. We've got more eye-opening conversations and hard-hitting insights coming your way, so make sure you subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcast, and stay ready, because the next episode might just change the way you see law enforcement forever.